Well, good afternoon. We're here once again, and today we'll talk about Chapter 9, Religion and Morality. What is morality? Well, basically, morality is a set of norms designed to regulate and govern the conduct of humans with each other, with other living creatures, and with their environment. In other words, a morality is how you decide to treat each other. It's very simple. Most religions have a form of morality. Now, I say most because there are a few ancient religions that aren't around anymore that really didn't have a morality. The entire base of the religion was basically on keeping the gods happy. So as long as you did the appropriate sacrifices and rituals that made the gods happy, they really weren't concerned with how humans treated each other or other people or their environment. As long as the gods were happy, you'd be happy, was the idea. But most religions do have a morality, and these moralities will tell us how we're supposed to live, in what manner or fashion we should conduct ourselves. Socrates, who was a Greek philosopher I'm sure you've heard of, said that actually that was the most important question a human could ask themselves. How will I live? What kind of, he used the term man, but we could use the term person just as easily. What type of person will I be? And this is where we start to form morality. Now, there is a difference between the words moralities and ethics. However, for the purposes of our conversation today, we're going to use them pretty much interchangeably. We don't need to worry about the little picayune differences to those, at least in this lecture. So there are a lot of different types of moralities in many different religions. Two that we see quite often in different religions. One is the divine command theory, and the other is called Confucian virtue. The divine command theory is very simple. It states that what is morally good is what God commands, and what is morally wrong is what God prohibits. A very good example of this is the religion of Islam. But then it gets a little bit more confusing. Islam would have this, so would Judaism, so would Christianity for that matter, and quite a few other religions in the world. And there are well, if we go by the Islamic thought, there are two different types of divine command theory. One says, the Asherite school of theology says that God's commands and prohibitions are the only thing that makes something right or wrong. If something is right or wrong, it's because God, or in the case of Islam, Allah, says that it's right or wrong. So God may say it's wrong to wear red socks, and that makes it wrong to wear red socks. And if somebody says, but why is it wrong to wear red socks? What's wrong with red socks? It doesn't matter if anything is or isn't wrong about wearing red socks according to human logic. It matters what God says. They think that, how can I put this? They believe that if God is able to only command things that can be determined by human reason, then God wouldn't be absolutely sovereign and omnipotent. All-powerful is what omnipotent means. The Asherites believe that the basis of human reason is in God's will, not in human reason. Does that make sense? In other words, we may not be able to figure out why or why not God says to do or not do something, but it doesn't matter if we understand it or not. God said, and that's how it is. Okay. Okay. The other school of thought about the divine command theory, coming from the Islamic idea, was by the Mutazilas. Now, forgive me if I am not pronouncing that word correctly. It's spelled Mutazila, I believe. But this is interesting. Their school of thought says that God commands things because he knows these things are right, and he prohibits things because he knows these things are wrong, and human reason is able to understand it. In other words, if you think about it, you can figure out why God prohibits or commands certain things. Okay, this is saying that God always has a reason, and that humans can understand the reasoning and indeed should try to understand the reasoning. They believe that the Asherite version of the divine command theory kind of reduces the theory to a matter of blind obedience. If you're just following orders, if you're just doing this because God said to or God said not to, then you have no individual morality at all. You're not making a choice. You're not thinking about your own morality. You're leaving it all up to God. Well, that's one way to look at it, right? In other words, if something is moral only because God says so, not because there's an actual reason behind it, well, what if God changes his mind? And if you're thinking, well, God doesn't change or Allah doesn't change, certainly you can't limit God. If God would like to change his mind, shouldn't God be able to change his mind? But does that mean that God changes his mind and says something is immoral one day and moral the next? And where would that leave humans? Some would argue that God's will is eternally the same. But like I said, if we don't want to put logical limits on God, then we have to allow for the idea that God can change their mind or her mind or his mind about what's moral and what isn't. To the Mutazilas, the Asherites' idea of God's commands and prohibitions not being able to be understood by human is kind of a capricious idea. And they just don't agree with it. So, another form of morality that you often hear about is Confucian virtue. Confucian virtue. Who do you suppose that's named after? And you're right, Confucius, that ancient Chinese sage. Confucius said that the only purpose a man, and once again you can use the term human here, the only purpose a man can have, and also the only worthwhile thing a man can do, is to become as good of a man as possible. According to Confucius, good people live good lives and thus create a good society. And in fact, for Confucius, this is why somebody should live a good life, because it will help create that good society. Well, that's one way to think about it. When we are talking about Confucian virtue, we're also speaking about what's called virtue-based ethics. What are virtue-based ethics? That's an ethic based on the idea that the primary moral guides will not be rules or commands or laws, but the primary moral guides are people. People who exhibit some type of moral excellence or ideal moral character. So be like this person and you will be moral. And that was one of Confucian's ideas from the very beginning, actually. It's picking someone to be a moral exemplar and following how they live their life. Now, in Islam and Christianity and Judaism and other religions, you tend to find what are called duty ethics, D-U-T-Y. Sometimes they're called deontological ethics, D-E-O-N-T-O-L-O-G-I-C-A-L. Duty ethics and deontological ethics are two different terms for the same thing. And duty ethics state that the primary moral obligation is for each person to do his or her duty, regardless of what their station in life is. If they have a particular job, if they have a particular, if they're parents, if they're grandparents, if they're president, if they're king, if they're teachers, if they're lawyers, if they're plumbers, everybody needs to do their duty according to their particular station. And doing their duty would center around rules and commands and prohibitions that spell out exactly what the duty is of that particular person. And if you follow the rules and the commands, if you do your duty, then you would be considered a moral person. Now, this sounds as if it's very cut and dried between Confucianism and Islam and Christianity and Judaism, and it's really not. These two terms, virtue-based ethics and duty ethics, they're broad understandings within these two religions, and both religions have moralities that contain elements of both duty and virtue ethics in each one. For example, even though that you could say that Islam or Christianity is based on duty or deontological ethics, which would be true to a certain degree. But if you'll remember, quite some time ago when I was probably in my 20s, every Christian youth group in America were wearing little rubber bracelets that said WWJD, which meant, of course, what would Jesus do? And the idea behind that is that if you caught yourself in a morally ambiguous situation, the first thing you did to help you make a moral decision would be to stop and ask yourself, what would Jesus do? In other words, you would use Jesus as your moral exemplar and follow his example. Well, this gives you a touch of virtue ethics, just like you'd see in Confucianism. You would find somebody respected as a moral being, and you'd follow their lead. But we find that in a usually duty-based ethics, such as Christianity. And for that matter, Confucianism has rules too. It's not as if it's completely free and lawless. So these are broad understandings of duty ethics and virtue-based ethics. Don't be too quick to put them into categories, if you will, although obviously they are categories. As far as duty-based ethics in Confucianism, well, Confucian said that Ren, R-E-N, or benevolence, that is kindness, goodness to other people, is a moral obligation. In a sense, Confucius is setting up Ren as a rule or command or duty that people must follow. But yet, this is coming out of a morality that is mainly virtue-based. So you can see how this certainly changes a little bit. It's not as strict as it would seem completely. And if we look at Islam, well, Islam certainly depends on the virtue element as well as the duty ethics. When we look at the emphasis that Islam placed on the example of the Prophet and a book called the Sunnah, which is also called the Customs of the Prophet Muhammad. It contains his actions and his words. There's this idea that if you're not sure what to do, look at how Muhammad lived and base your actions on his, and then you will be moral. You will make the right moral choice. Another way that morality is sometimes identified and justified is through something called natural law. And we see examples of natural law in quite a few religions. Today, let's look at the one that we see mainly in Christianity. Natural law refers to the idea that morality is built by God into the very structure of the universe, into the natural world itself. And while there are different versions of natural law, the one that's probably most widely recognized and used in Christianity was formulated and explained by St. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas he's considered the doctor of the Roman Catholic Church, and I don't mean doctor like physician, I mean doctor like doctor of philosophy, basically. He knew that his stuff. He's the big theologian in the Catholic Church. But according to Aquinas, natural law is derived from the eternal law of God, which governs the universe. And when you want to use natural law to decide if something is moral or immoral, it all begins with the question, is this thing I want to decide about, is it natural? In other words, can you find it in the natural world? Well, if it's natural, if you decide that it is natural, then it is morally good. If it is unnatural, then it is morally wrong. Some of the examples in your textbook include the idea of the wrongness of suicide and the rightness of monogamy and how these fit into the natural world. I'm sure by now you have figured out that there are certain issues that occur when there isn't an agreement about things that are natural and not natural. And to be quite honest, the further along humanity gets in science and studying the natural world, the more we come to understand, and the more we understand what is and isn't natural isn't always set in stone. It just doesn't work like that. And then there's a big issue with natural law, and this is the idea that there's something called the rule of reciprocity that you usually have in any system of morality or ethics. The rule of reciprocity requires equal treatment of all people in a particular culture. All people, whether they're men and women, black and white, children and adults, really of all citizens. Morality should apply to everyone. And some people will say that natural law often runs counter to that conclusion. In nature, for example, it's usually understood that the bigger, stronger, better fed animals tend to rule, and the ones who are weak, who haven't got enough to eat, are much more likely to die or to be ruled over, if you will, within their animal groups. But is that the rule of reciprocity for humans? No, and I can understand that animals don't always have the rule of reciprocity, but shouldn't humans have that? In other words, if I do something wrong, if I rob a bank, I think the morality would tell us it's wrong to rob banks. It's wrong to take what isn't yours. If I rob a bank and I'm sentenced to, I don't know, 10 years in prison, okay, maybe I deserve what I get. But what if somebody else robs a bank? They take the same amount of money as I do. They use the same type of weapon as I do. Our MO is exactly the same. But yet they get to court. They even use the same lawyer I have. But they're different than I am. Maybe they're taller. Not unusual. Most people are taller than I am. But when they get to court, the judge says, well, you shouldn't have done that. It's wrong to rob banks, but you're tall. And I really like tall people. And it's natural that a taller person be given, uh, a little more leeway. That's the natural thing. You see it in the animal world. The bigger, taller animals get to do more. So you're not going to get 10 years in prison. We'll give you a month in the county jail. That doesn't quite work, doesn't it? The equal treatment isn't seen there. So that's another issue with natural law. Some people would say natural law runs counter to the conclusion of the rule of reciprocity. Well, we've discussed some ways to decide what is and isn't moral, but surely there are some elements of religious morality. That is, surely it has a few things in every religious morality that helps us decide what is moral, what isn't moral. What do you have to do? Well, you're right, there is. And a man named Ronald Green presented three essential elements of religious morality. That is, if morality, as we said, is a set of norms designed to regulate and govern the conduct of humans with one another, with other living creatures, and with the environment, then religious morality, that is, morality set by one's religious beliefs, must also have certain types of elements. And in fact, Ronald Green said, there's actually three. These three elements are that it has to have a method of moral reasoning, it has to have retribution, and we'll talk about these in turn. And this third one has to do with our failure to be moral. It has to have a way to overcome moral paralysis and despair. And these aren't hard to understand, but all religious moralities must have these three elements. So let's start with the method of moral reasoning, sometimes called a moral point of view. In other words, in order to reason in a moral manner, you have to start with kind of a universal, overarching idea of what is impartial and what is fair. We have to understand that the moral way is not necessarily what we desire for ourselves, but would be the right thing for every person. It would be the fair thing for all. One of the best ideas of moral reasoning, according to Green, is the golden rule. The golden rule, yeah, that same thing you learned in kindergarten. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Treat others the way you would like to be treated. In other words, fairly, I'm sure. And believe it or not, there are several, in fact, many different forms of the golden rule that are found in many different religions. It's not something that Christians have, a monopoly on. It's a very common idea. But the moral point of view, whether it's the golden rule or something else, will require one to put aside their self-interest and do what is right for everyone. Well, that's a pretty good idea. Now, the second of Green's elements, as I said, is retribution. What do I mean by retribution? Retribution is when the good people are rewarded and the bad people or the immoral people are punished. Humans have a huge need to know that rules are rules and that they're going to be held accountable for the rules, whether they follow them or whether they don't. And we're assured that all are held accountable using the same measuring stick. Like in my example earlier, if I rob a bank and somebody else robs a bank, we should be both held accountable to the same standard when we do the same crime or sin or immorality, whatever you want to call it here. It's a good idea. Because if there's only punishment, people will go out of their way to find a way not to get punished. If there's only reward, people don't mind being immoral because it's not going to hurt them. They just don't get a reward. They stay the same as they are. So you have to find both retribution and punishment when people fail to live up to the moral standards in a community. And then the third of Green's elements, it has to do with our failure to be moral. It's called overcoming moral paralysis, right? What in the world? Overcoming moral paralysis and despair, I should say. This is the idea that there has to be set up a way in which after a person chooses to be immoral and then suffers some type of retribution, there is a way to bring them back into the community. Usually, if somebody tends to be very moral but makes a mistake and chooses an immoral choice, they tend to feel more guilty than ever. After their retribution is over, if you can't find a way to bring them back into the fold, to let them feel like they can start over and have a second chance at morality, then any religion will lose the people. It can't be a once immoral, always immoral type of thing. There has to be a way to allow them to come back into the community and continue life as a moral citizen. Very often in Christianity and in other religions, they'll have something similar to confessing their sins and repenting, that is, turning away from their sin and back to the moral life and being accepted by the congregation or the community in that way. And most religious communities have a way to deal with the fact that sometimes people make mistakes, but you can come back from that. And if you're wondering about that moral despair part of this one, the fact is, if people feel as if they will never be able to be moral again, that they will never be allowed back into that good community, then they will despair of it and they will stop trying and they will go down a very dangerous path and get more and more immoral and make more and more bad choices. The despair comes when they feel so guilty about what they've done, as if they will never be able to be good. They stop trying. And too much guilt on somebody can lead to this moral paralysis and despair. So they need to have that assurance of grace and forgiveness after they repent and an ability to move on. Chapter 9 is not very hard. It's not a difficult chapter. However, I do want to encourage you to read your book very carefully. And I want you to understand the different types of divine command theory, the different types of morality, how you come about that. Make sure you know Ronald Green's 3 elements. That's very important. And spend a little bit of time as you're reading to think about how Chapter 9 would apply to your own reasoning and your own religion in morality. See if he's left something out that might apply to your religious understanding. Maybe he's included more than you've ever thought about. Let this chapter kind of sink in so that you can see how morality affects your own life and your own religion. I'll talk to you later, but that's enough for today. Have a great day. Bye-bye.